Why was she the only one not laughing when the Marine's last shot missed? The wind came off the flats in long, dusty breaths that made the steel plates sing and the flags sag. It carried that strange stillness, the kind that happens when a crowd wants to cheer but doesn't know if it should. The rifles had stopped firing. The spotter's voice had cracked once, calling soft right just outside the ring, and then the world seemed to lose its rhythm. A few chuckles broke loose in the bleachers, nervous, unsure. Laughter that apologized as it came. She stood near the vendor tent, just another volunteer in a navy ball cap, pouring paper cups of water. Her arms looked like they belonged to someone who built fences, not served drinks, strong, steady, weathered. There was a dark smudge of grease beneath one fingernail and a thin, pale scar across her right knuckle, the kind that only happens when a rifle bolt bites you once, and you make sure it never does again. When the captain barked next, and no one moved, she raised one finger. "Sir," she said, calm, even, "can I borrow your rifle?" The air changed, people turned, the spotter blinked, the captain's mouth pulled toward a smirk. They didn't know who she was yet, but they would. Before all this, before the wind and the flags and the quiet challenge, she'd lived by rhythm, not routine. Every morning before the sun climbed over the red desert ridge, Tessa Rowan ran, not for fitness, not for pride, but because motion kept the silence from growing too loud. Her boots found the same dirt trail along the riverbed each dawn, the same dry curve, the same rhythm of breath. The kind that keeps memory at bay until you're ready to face it again. At 35, she worked at Sierra Vista Hardware, a squat concrete store with one flickering sign and a bell that chimed when the door opened. The smell of oil, wood, and gunmetal hung in the air, a smell that clung to her even after hours. Customers came for nails, rope, and pipe fittings, a few for ammunition boxes. None looked twice at the woman behind the counter. They didn't see the hands, steady hands marked by thin scars and faint burns, hands that used to know the weight of a rifle stock, the rhythm of breath and trigger, hands that had once been trusted by men who taught others how to fight. She never told anyone, not even Mr. Dale, the owner, a retired Air Force mechanic who'd learned to spot competence like an instinct. "You don't belong behind this counter forever," he used to tell her. She'd only smile, sort the nails by size, and change the subject. Because some truths weren't ready to be spoken again. Years ago she'd been someone else, an instructor, a consultant, a woman who knew how to read wind better than most machines could calculate it. But after one accident, one mistake that wasn't entirely hers, she'd left that world without noise. A training shot gone wrong, a soldier's career ended, and a silence that settled over her like dust. No bitterness, no headlines, just quiet withdrawal. Now she lived with her mother in a one-story house with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when the wind shifted. Her mother, Anne, moved slowly from an old injury but smiled like it never hurt. She filled the home with desert plants that shouldn't have survived but did. They both understood silence, one from years of care, the other from years of regret. Tessa didn't own much, a few tools, an old truck, a worn rifle cleaning kit hidden beneath her workbench, ritual, not readiness. On quiet Sundays, she'd polish the brushes, oil the rods, then put it all back untouched. Once in a while, young Marines from the nearby base came into the shop, swaggering, loud, joking about optics and recoil. She'd listen quietly until one mentioned a scope problem or a drift they couldn't fix. Then she'd step forward, soft-voiced. "If it's pulling left," she'd say, "check the recoil lug before you touch the zero." Half the time they'd nod politely and move on. The other half would laugh, dismissing her as the quiet hardware clerk. But sometimes they came back later, embarrassed, half grinning. "Ma'am, that fixed it. How'd you know?" She'd shrug, lucky guess. But the truth was, nothing about Tessa Rowan had ever been luck. That's how Corporal Briggs met her, one of those fresh-faced Marines who still carried nervous respect in their voice. He came in for cleaning patches and thread locker, noticed her glance at the insignia on his sleeve, and mentioned almost casually, "We're getting ready for the fundraiser shoot this weekend. You should come by." She nodded. "For the rehab center, right? You'll raise plenty." "Yeah, you shoot. Used to." He caught the weight in that pause, the kind that says there's a story underneath, but you're not invited to hear it yet. That night she sat at the kitchen table across from her mother, scrolling the event notice on her phone. Veterans Rehabilitation Fundraiser Match. Free admission. Donations welcome. Her mother noticed the look in her eyes. "You're thinking about going?" "Maybe," she said. Anne smiled softly. "You used to love those ranges." Tessa looked at her hands. "I used to love the calm before the shot." That was the truth of it. Not the noise, not the trophies, just the quiet between heartbeats. The moment the world held still long enough to decide who you really were. When Saturday came, she didn't plan to compete. She just wanted to help. She wore her old tan boots, a faded store t-shirt, pulled her braid through the back of her cap, and drove out before she could change her mind. By 9, the range was already alive, sun blazing, flags snapping, vendors hawking lemonade and burgers. Children waved tiny flags. Marines laughed and shouted over the noise. She stayed behind the vendor tent, pouring water, collecting empty cups, just another volunteer. But as the morning stretched and the air grew heavier, she started to feel it, the wrong rhythm, the drift, the tiny errors in movement that told her everything she needed to know. The rifles began missing, not badly at first, just low right a few inches off. Then worse. The wind came restless, the air shimmering over the targets like heat swimming on glass. She saw it before they did. The mounts were over-torqued. The barrels were fighting the heat. Every correction made things worse. She hesitated, then stepped closer to the line. The captain stood with his arms folded, pride stiff as his posture. "Sir," she said quietly, "it might be the mount alignment. It's pulling right as the barrel heats." He turned his head just enough to see her. "Hardware tips won't save a Marine rifle, ma'am." A few Marines chuckled. She nodded once. "Understood, sir." Then she went back to the tent. The next shot went wide, the next missed completely. The spotter's tone turned flat. "Off steel, off steel." The crowd began to shift, uneasy. A few polite claps tried to fill the silence. It didn't help. Someone laughed too loud and the sound cracked through the air like a bad omen. "Next," the captain shouted. No one moved. The air went still again. The flags drooped. The heat pressed down heavy and indifferent. Tessa set down her tray. Her right hand brushed a line of grease from her nail. She didn't raise her voice, didn't even look at him. "Sir," she said, calm, even, "may I borrow your rifle?" It wasn't a challenge, it was a statement. But it sliced through everything. The murmurs, the wind, the brittle pride that had filled the air moments ago. Heads turned, cameras lifted. The captain froze, caught between disbelief and offense. "Ma'am, this isn't an open mic night." She didn't flinch. "Understood, sir, but your mounts are over-torqued. I can demonstrate." The crowd leaned forward as if gravity itself had shifted. The sound of phone shutters built like dry wind through tall grass. "You think you can outshoot Marines?" he asked, the smirk almost holding. "No, sir," she said. "I think I can show you why they're missing." Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but waiting. And then he laughed, brittle, forced. "Fine, be my guest." She stepped forward through the dust and heat, braid brushing her shoulder. The smell of oil and burnt powder hung thick. She stopped beside the rifle, eyes calm, movements unhurried. "I'll need to adjust the bipod," she said. "Do whatever you need," he replied, still performing for the crowd. She crouched beside the rifle. No hesitation, no showmanship. Her fingers found each knob and screw with a familiarity that couldn't be faked. The scar across her knuckle caught the light. The spotter frowned, leaning in closer. A kid whispered, "She's done that before." She finished her adjustments, checked the level, breathed once. Range is hot. The officer hesitated, glancing at the captain. Hot, the captain said finally. Tessa nodded once, then lay behind the rifle. Her cheeks settled against the stock. Her hands found their place without thought. She didn't breathe yet. The crowd leaned forward. Phones lifted. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" No one answered. And in that heat, under a sky that shimmered like glass, Tessa Rowan prepared to remind them. The flags tugged in lazy rhythm. The mirage bent the horizon. She read every shift, every flicker of air, every ripple of truth the wind was trying to hide. Then, clank, the steel plate jumped bright dead center. A sound so clean it walked the distance back to them like proof. The spotter flinched, the bleachers gasped. She didn't look up. Her finger reset. Clank. Second shot, center again. And in that moment the laughter died, replaced by something else, something heavier. Respect. They didn't know her story. Not yet. But from that point forward, every man, woman, and child on that range would learn her name. Why did her hands never shake, when every eye on that range was waiting for her to fail? The silence hung so tightly you could hear the grit shift under her elbows. The flags sagged in the hot air. The rifle barrel shimmered in the mirage like something alive. She stayed motionless, cheek resting against the comb, body lined with the weapon as if she'd been born in that position. Someone in the bleachers whispered, "She's not even breathing." But she was, just barely. A controlled inhale, a held breath, then a release so slow it barely disturbed the dust at her lips. The stillness of someone who'd spent years listening to wind more closely than words. Range is hot, the spotter murmured again, not because he needed to, just to hear something human. Tessa didn't move. She let the wind shift once, twice, watched the flag near the 600-yard line dance with a small, erratic flutter. The far flag told the truth, twitching once to the left. That was the one she trusted. The rest were distractions. Clank. The third shot found home. The spotter's head jerked up from his scope. Hit, center. His voice cracked on the second word. The captain folded his arms tighter, jaw set. Lucky grouping. But it wasn't luck. She waded through the next breeze, shoulders perfectly still. Her pulse stayed steady, calm as if she'd been alone on a quiet morning instead of surrounded by hundreds. Clank. Fourth shot. She didn't blink. Somewhere in the bleachers, a child started clapping until his father placed a hand on his shoulder. The sound fell quiet again. It wasn't time for applause. The moment felt too fragile, too sacred to break. Tessa reset her grip. Her left hand cradled the rifle's fore end as if holding something alive. The wind eased just enough to tempt a careless shooter into firing too soon. She didn't. She waited, reading the air like a second language. Clank fifth. Her rhythm wasn't technical, it was human, honest. She breathed when the wind breathed, pressed when it exhaled. By the sixth shot, the crowd began to sense it. Something unspoken moved through the bleachers, a growing awareness that what they were watching wasn't defiance. It was discipline. The spotter adjusted his glass, sweat beading under his brow. She's holding half a minute high, reading the shimmer, not the flag. The captain didn't answer. His smirk had faded, leaving behind something harder to define. Curiosity, maybe regret. Tessa's next breath came shallow. The heat rippled downrange, twisting light into invisible ribbons. Her eyes followed it the way a musician follows a score. Clank. Six. The spotter whispered, "That's textbook. That's—" He stopped himself. The captain heard the start of reverence and didn't correct him. She gave the rifle a hair more left, less than a click, just a thought. Clank 7. Her cheek pressed gently against the comb, her body rising and falling with slow, almost invisible rhythm. Someone muttered, She's reading the wind like it's talking to her. Maybe it was. By the 10th shot, the crowd had forgotten their phones. The first few rows leaned forward, eyes wide, jaws set, caught in that strange awe you feel when you're watching someone become something you didn't know humans could be. Clank 10. No one cheered. No one moved. The applause that should have come stayed trapped in people's throats. The spotter whispered, "She's not chasing the target. She's waiting for the truth to reveal itself." She once told a group of young soldiers something like that back when she was still teaching. They hadn't understood it then. You don't chase wind, you listen to it. You don't fight the distance. You let it tell you who you are. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, eyes wet from heat. The world narrowed to a circle of glass and sand. Clank 11, 12, 13. The rhythm settled in, the kind of rhythm that doesn't need counting. She no longer existed as a person on that range. She was a motion, a metronome of precision, each shot an agreement between physics and patience. By 20, the captain had stopped pretending. His arms hung loosely now. The smirk was gone. The pride was still there, but it had changed shape. Respect had begun to take root in it. He glanced at the spotter. What's she doing differently? The spotter didn't look away from the glass. She's trusting the far flag, not the near, and she's letting the rifle breathe. Letting it breathe. Yeah, the spotter's voice was quiet, reverent. She's not forcing it to perform. She's letting it settle back into alignment after every shot. You can't rush that, not if you understand it. Tessa's right hand shifted slightly, wiping a streak of sweat against her sleeve. The rifle's metal gleamed. Her hair stuck to her neck. She ignored it all. Clank 21. The wind shifted, barely perceptible, but she felt it in her cheek, in the way the mirage flickered just off-center. She adjusted nothing. She trusted her first reading. Clank 22. The spotter spoke to no one, not even realizing he'd said it aloud. She's reading the wind, not the data. It wasn't a correction, it was a confession. The phrase moved through the bleachers like a whisper. People repeated it, not because they understood it, but because it sounded like truth. She paused to sip a shallow breath. Sweat rolled along her temple, darkening her collar. The crowd stayed utterly still. Clank 23. The captain's sunglasses had slid down his nose. He didn't fix them. He just watched. The sound of steel against air became hypnotic, each impact a heartbeat, steady, sure, undeniable. Clank 24. The boy in the front row, the same one who tried to clap earlier, whispered, "She hasn't missed once." His mother hushed him, but her voice trembled with awe, not irritation. Tessa's pulse slowed to a crawl. She no longer saw the crowd or the Marines or even the range, only the line of truth between her and the steel. Every flag told a different story, but only one told the truth. The far flag, always the far flag. It flicked, paused, and in that pause she pressed the trigger. Clank. 25. The sound rolled home, deep and sure. Somewhere behind her the spotter exhaled. "That's impossible," he muttered. "No drift at all." But it wasn't impossible. It was practice. Years of unseen hours. The kind that don't come with medals or applause. The kind that no one watches until they have to. By 30, the air around her had changed. Not just temperature, not just sound. The entire energy of the place had shifted. The laughter was gone. The arrogance was gone. What remained was silence. The kind of silence that builds when people realize they're witnessing something that belongs more to reverence than entertainment. Clank. 31-32. The wind tugged once, hard enough to spook an average shooter into a miss. She didn't bite. She waited it out. The plate rang again, perfect, dead center. Clank 33. Behind her, the captain whispered something the microphones didn't catch. Maybe a prayer, maybe an apology. By 35, the spotter had stopped keeping notes. His pencil hovered over the page, then dropped to his lap. What was there left to write? Clank 36. He leaned forward, watching the rise of her shoulder, the set of her cheek. Patience, he whispered, as if reminding himself. The lieutenant colonel, too, rose back, hadn't moved in minutes. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked downrange. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was sure he'd seen that form before. The quiet, efficient grace of someone who'd once taught others how to do this very thing. Clank 37. The range officer stopped, glancing at his stopwatch. There was no point. Time didn't live here anymore. The sun blistered the sand. Sweat stung her eyes. Her heartbeat stayed steady. She blinked away the burn and breathed. Clank 38, 39. And then the 40th shot landed, clean, certain, no echo out of place. That's when it hit them all. The crowd, the officers, the Marines who'd laughed earlier. They understood now. This wasn't showmanship. This wasn't luck. This was muscle memory turned into grace. The spotter whispered, voice trembling, "She's not shooting for the crowd. She's talking to the distance." And the distance, it seemed, was finally answering. By the 50th shot, the sun had begun to soften. The shadows grew longer, the heat less cruel. But Tessa stayed locked in that strange stillness, the kind that lives between control and surrender. Her right hand steadied the bolt. Her breathing stayed deliberate. Every motion spoke of years she'd never brag about. Clank 50. No one clapped. They couldn't. They were still holding their breath. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there to listen, to the wind, the silence, the truth that doesn't shout. Because deep down, Tessa Rowan knew what every good marksman eventually learns. You don't conquer distance, you make peace with it. And every shot she took that day was another quiet truce with the past she'd been running from. What was she really aiming at that day? The target, or the past she'd never forgiven herself for? By the time her count passed 50, even the wind seemed to understand it was witnessing something sacred. It softened, then held still. The heat shimmered, glass-like, over the flats, and the smell of burnt powder lingered like the breath of something ancient. The crowd sat motionless. Even the restless children had gone quiet, their eyes wide, their tiny flags limp in their hands. Every ring of steel rolled back over them like a heartbeat. Tessa's world had narrowed to one thing, the circle of glass and light in front of her. She could feel the rifle's rhythm, its small recoil, its whisper of vibration through the stock into her shoulder. The sound it made was no longer noise. It was language. And beneath that calm, beneath the mechanical precision, was something heavier. Guilt. The kind that doesn't vanish, just sleeps until it's called. She had taught young soldiers once. She stood under skis like this before, showing them how to read the flags, how to feel the wind without chasing it. One of them, a boy with too much confidence and too little patience, hadn't listened. The wind changed mid-drill. A bullet drifted. An injury, a career lost. A report filed. Her name written at the bottom in clean black ink. She signed it without argument. Then she'd packed up her things and left before sunrise the next morning. Tessa hadn't touched a rifle since. Until now. Clank 51. The sound didn't echo anymore. It just blended into the air, becoming part of the day itself. The captain stood at the edge of the line. His earlier arrogance eroded into something far quieter. His mouth stayed closed now. His jaw flexed only once when another shot landed dead center. Clank 52. Behind him, the spotter had stopped pretending this was ordinary. His notebook lay forgotten on the table. His hand hovered near the glass but didn't adjust it. He didn't need to. She wasn't missing. Every few minutes, someone in the crowd whispered her name, still testing the syllables like a secret. Who is she? No one answered yet. Down the line, Corporal Briggs, who'd invited her to the match, stood with his cap in his hands, guilt and pride twisting in equal measure across his face. He'd seen her once in the hardware store, wiping grease from her hands, talking about recoil lugs. Now she was here, rewriting what everyone thought they knew about mastery. Clank 53. She adjusted her grip only when the rifle asked for it. Her shoulder rolled once, the way someone might stretch a muscle before continuing a long, patient dance. Wind shifting, the spotter murmured to no one. She knew the flags told her, the mirage bent, the sand hissed in faint ribbons across the ground. She gave a fraction of correction, less than a thought. Clank 54. The plate trembled, then steadied, a coin of sunlight nailed perfectly in place. From the stands, an older man with silver hair leaned forward. He'd been quiet the entire time, hat in his lap, a veteran stare in his eyes. "That hold," he whispered to the man beside him, "that's not self-taught." The man beside him nodded slowly. "No, that's training, deep training." They were right. At Fort Benning years ago, her cadence had been the example. Other instructors had studied her breathing, her patience, her refusal to let weather dictate emotion. But time has a way of stealing your confidence, even from the steady-handed. And when that one accident happened, it wasn't just her reputation that took the hit, it was her faith in her own steadiness. Clank 55. She felt the recoil slide through her shoulder and out into the ground. Her fingers eased. Her pulse never spiked. 56. The captain bent slightly, as if leaning might help him understand. "How's she doing that?" he murmured. The spotter answered without turning his head. "She's not fighting the gun. She's letting it tell her where to go." Letting it. The spotter's voice softened. You ever work with someone who's done the job so long they stop thinking about it? They just become it. The captain didn't reply. Because that's what she was now. A part of the weapon, a part of the air, a part of the rhythm. Clank 57. The crowd's energy began to shift again. It wasn't just awe anymore. It was emotion, pride, something communal. Parents pulled their children a little closer, whispering things they'd want them to remember. Patience, focus, grace under pressure. The Marines near the rope line stood straighter, quieter. A few even saluted, not to her, but to what she represented. Discipline without ego. Strength without noise. Clank 58. A few reporters in the press tent exchanged confused looks. None of them had come prepared to cover this. They'd expected pie contests and donation totals, not history. The man from the local paper scribbled something new at the top of his page. A woman with a hardware shirt showed the Marines what humility looks like with a trigger. Clank 59. Each impact rolled out like a heartbeat against steel. Tessa's breathing stayed the same. Her lips barely parted with each exhale. Sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't blink until it dried on its own. Clank 60. The wind argued again. Near flags lied. Mid flags hesitated. The far one, the honest one, bent slightly right, then froze. She waited 2 seconds. Pressed. Clank 61. The sound was soft, but it carried all the way to the bleachers. In that moment, the lieutenant colonel in the third row straightened. He'd been silent so long, the motion itself drew attention. His eyes locked on the scar on her knuckle. Something flickered, recognition. He whispered to the sergeant beside him, "That scar, I've seen it before." The sergeant frowned. "Sir." She taught a wind clinic at Benning 3 summers ago. Mirage timing, far flag reading. She called the scar her tuition. The sergeant's mouth fell open. "You mean that's?" The colonel nodded slowly. "Rowan." The name hit the crowd like a ripple, spreading row by row. Rowan. Tessa Rowan. The same name that still hung on the record board at the Army Marksmanship Unit, even years later. Clank 62. The captain froze. The realization hit him harder than the heat. His jaw loosened, his eyes darted from the colonel to her. He just mocked one of the finest wind readers the service had ever trained. The spotter blinked, stunned. "Sir," he said softly, "she's doing everything I've been trying to learn for 2 years. She's reading the air like it's talking to her." The colonel didn't answer. He just stood and began making his way slowly down toward the rope line, cap tucked beneath his arm. Tessa fired again. Clank 63. The sound walked the ground between her and the audience like a reminder. Skill is its own defense. By 70, no one in the stands moved. The air had become reverent. She paused once, not from fatigue but respect. She brushed a fingertip against the rifle's side, a silent thank you to the metal for holding steady. She'd never been religious, but that small gesture looked like prayer. Clank 71. The lieutenant colonel stopped just behind the rope line. He didn't cross it. He didn't need to. He watched quietly as she settled back into position, reading the mirage, adjusting for heat shimmer. When the next round hit, he nodded once to no one. "That's her," he whispered. Someone behind him murmured, "Who?" "The one who taught half the shooters in this state how to see wind." The word spread. The hardware clerk had a name now, and that name carried weight. Clank 72. She didn't hear the murmurs, or maybe she did and chose to ignore them. The sound of respect wasn't what she'd come for. She came for silence, for redemption, for proof, not to anyone else but to herself, that the accident hadn't broken her craft, just buried it. And as the final hours of sunlight stretched thin across the flats, the truth began to show itself with every strike of steel. Skill doesn't die. It waits, like wind before a storm, like calm before a shot. Clank 73. The colonel folded his arms loosely, watching as the captain took a step forward, humbler now, chin dipped in silent admiration. And as the 74th shot rang true, one truth became clear to everyone there. She wasn't there to defeat the Marines. She was there to remind them what discipline really looked like. Why didn't she ever look proud? By the time the 75th shot rang across the flats, most people would have been trembling from fatigue or grinning through adrenaline. But Tessa didn't do either. Her breathing stayed calm, eyes fixed on the shimmer downrange. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just worked. The rifle barked again. Clank 76. The steel plate danced, sunlight flashing from its center. The crowd reacted with a low murmur, like the air itself had sighed. "Who is she?" someone whispered again. This time the answer didn't hide. "Rowan," came a voice from the rope line. It wasn't shouted, just spoken with quiet certainty. The lieutenant colonel stood there, cap tucked under his arm, his silver hair bright under the sun. "Tessa Rowan." The captain turned sharply. "Sir." "She used to teach at Bennying," the colonel said. "Civilian instructor, wind calibration, mirage reading. She's the reason half your range cards work." The captain blinked, words dying in his throat. He looked back at the woman lying behind the rifle, the one he'd dismissed minutes earlier as a hardware clerk with an opinion. She didn't look up, didn't even flinch. Clank 77. The spotter swallowed hard. His voice came thin but awed. "Sir, she's doing everything I've been trying to learn. The wind, the mirage, the recoil pattern, it's all instinct. She's reading the range." The colonel's jaw tightened, not in anger but in memory. "She trained instructors, taught us how to listen to silence." A few Marines nearby exchanged looks. One muttered, "I've read her module." Rowan T thought it was a guy. Clank 78. No one laughed, not anymore. The captain stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. The sound seemed too loud, like an intrusion. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Ma'am," he began. The word felt strange coming out of him, softer than he was used to speaking. "You trained." "Keep your voice low, Captain," the colonel said gently. "You're standing in a classroom." That silenced him. Tessa didn't answer anyway. She stayed in the scope, focused, watching the far flag twitch once, twice, then freeze. Clank. 79. The crowd no longer felt like spectators. They were witnesses, the kind you find in churches, not stadiums. A boy near the front clutched his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is she like a coach?" His mother's eyes shone. "Better," she whispered. "She's who the coaches learn from." The air itself seemed to agree. Clank. 80. By now, every Marine on the line stood at attention, not because anyone told them to, but because their bodies understood respect before their minds caught up. The colonel's voice dropped to something like reverence. "You don't see that anymore. That level of calm, she's not fighting distance, she's honoring it." The captain didn't reply. His pride had melted into something purer, humility. The kind that doesn't feel like defeat but education. Tessa exhaled, slow and even, eyes never leaving the target. Her finger reset. Clank. 81. The crowd started to move as one organism, leaning forward, barely breathing, trying to memorize how she moved. The spotter murmured, "She's not even using the computer, just the air." He scribbled something in the margin of his notebook. Far flag first. Never trust numbers over nature. Then he drew a small scar over a stick hand and smiled to himself. Clank. 82. A gust picked up from the west, rolling dust through the field. The near flags whipped left, the mid flags hesitated, the far flag dipped once and held. She waited one breath, too. Then, clank. 83. The range officer's voice trembled as he called the count. 83 confirmed. He sounded like a man saying prayer instead of protocol. The colonel's face softened. She's not just showing them how it's done. She's showing them what it means to respect the craft. He turned slightly, speaking to no one in particular. Skill doesn't ask for applause, it asks for patience. Clank. 84. The sun had dropped lower now, stretching the shadows long across the sand. The heat shimmered less. The sound of steel echoed more clearly. Each impact rolled through the crowd's chest like a pulse. She gave a small adjustment, a quarter-inch left shift of her elbow, a minor tilt of her cheek to rest easier on the stock. Her body wasn't tense. It was graceful, like someone dancing with gravity. Clank. 85. A reporter near the press tent whispered to his camera operator, "Keep filming. This isn't a clip, this is history." He crossed out his earlier headline draft and wrote a new one. A woman named Rowan reminded a base what mastery looks like when silence takes aim. Clank. 86. The captain shifted closer, crouching beside the colonel. "Sir," he whispered, "that shot pattern's impossible, not with our mounts." The colonel nodded toward her. "It is with hers." He meant it literally, her touch, her understanding, her years. But there was something else in his tone too, something heavier. The knowledge that skill like hers comes from a cost most people never see. Because you can't teach peace without first surviving chaos. Clank. 87. For the first time, she blinked longer than usual. The sweat had reached her lashes. She brushed it away gently, never breaking her position. The plate downrange gleamed bright and scarred. Every hit made the center more beautiful. Clank. 88. In the bleachers, a retired range officer in a lawn chair leaned forward on his cane. "Bennying, huh?" he muttered. "That explains the patience." His wife nudged him. "What?" "She's one of the ones who wrote the wind rulebook." The woman stared at the line, then at Tessa's calm figure. "She doesn't look like she's proving anything." He smiled. "She's not." Clank. 89. The air shimmered once more, bending the horizon, but her sight picture never drifted. The world outside her scope didn't exist. And then something unexpected. One of the Marines behind the captain straightened, saluted toward her. No one told him to, it just happened. The colonel noticed and didn't stop it. He just whispered, let it spread. Clank. 90. One by one they did, Marines, veterans, even the civilians who'd been quiet too long. Not all saluted, but every posture softened, every stare carried reverence. This wasn't a competition anymore. It was a ceremony. The captain whispered, she's doing this for them, isn't she? The colonel nodded slowly, for all of us, for what we forgot. Clank. 91. Tessa's cheek pressed closer to the stock, eyes narrowing against the light. She didn't hear the whispers, or maybe she did, and that's why her next shot carried something heavier, something that sounded almost like forgiveness. Clank. 92. Her breathing slowed to nothing. The flags barely moved now, the wind tired from its own performance. The mirage flattened, honest and still. For the first time in hours, she lifted her head slightly, rolled her shoulder, and exhaled with a tremor of release. Not exhaustion, release. She'd proven something, to herself, not to them. Clank. 93. The colonel's eyes glistened. The captain said nothing. The spotter whispered, that's how patience looks when it finally finds peace. The range officer wiped his forehead, voice breaking as he called, 93 confirmed. Clank. 94. The crowd started to realize it was almost over. A sadness came with that thought, the strange ache you feel when beauty is temporary. Clank. 95. Each sound stretched a little longer now, like time wanted to hold on to it. The colonel stepped one pace forward, just shy of the rope. He didn't cross it. He didn't have to. His voice carried just enough to reach her. Rowan, he said softly, if you can hear me, thank you. She didn't turn, she didn't nod, but a single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, lost instantly to dust. Clank. 96. The sound rolled out slow, clean, certain. She was nearing the end. The rifle's barrel shimmered faintly from heat, but it hadn't wandered. It had obeyed her, trusted her. The captain stood straighter, pride blooming quietly inside his chest. Not pride in himself, but in her. In the craft. In what they all came from. Clank. 97. The crowd whispered her name, now not as gossip, but as reverence. Rowan. The sound of it moved like a current, soft, low, human. Clank. 98. The colonel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the echo fade. And in that breath of silence, he thought, this is what right looks like. The spotter's hands trembled against the scope. She hasn't missed a single plate, sir, he whispered. The captain nodded faintly. No, she hasn't. Clank. 99. And now, with only 2 shots left, the entire range leaned forward, the world holding its breath one final time. But Tessa didn't rush. She waited, because for her the end was never the goal. The end was just another chance to be steady. She looked downrange. The far flag bent once small, polite. The mirage shimmered one last time. She inhaled. Pressed. Clank. 100. The range officer lowered his clipboard, speechless. The colonel whispered something only the wind could hear. And though everyone knew it wasn't over yet, the air already felt complete. The last shot would not be for the record. It would be for her. What does silence sound like when it finally forgives you? The air over the flats had gone thin and golden. The heat no longer pressed. It hovered soft, exhausted. All across the range, not a breath dared move. Everyone's eyes were on her, and yet it felt as though she were alone again, back on those early morning trails, running through dust and dawn to keep the quiet at bay. 1 round left. The range officer whispered it, voice trembling. 1 round remaining. Tessa nodded once, as if answering a thought instead of a command. She opened the bolt, slid the last cartridge in, and closed it with a slow metallic click that seemed to echo for miles. Her hand lingered on the bolt handle a second longer, gratitude, not hesitation. Then she looked through the scope. The far flag bowed gently, its fabric catching the late sun. Every other flag was still. The mirage shimmered like breath over glass. This one was not about proving. It wasn't about redemption or records or applause. It was about closure. The long, patient conversation between her and distance that had waited 12 years for its final line. Her cheek found the stock. Her pulse slowed until it barely existed. The world narrowed to one small circle of glass and light. She exhaled. Pressed. Clank. 101. The sound didn't crack this time. It rang clear, perfect. A bell struck once for every hour she'd spent doubting herself. The echo rolled downrange, crossed the flats, and came home to her like a promise finally kept. For a moment, no one moved. Even the flags seemed to hold their breath. Then the lieutenant colonel stepped forward. He didn't shout, didn't smile. He simply removed his cap, straightened, and raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute. The gesture cut through the stillness like sunlight through dust. A sergeant followed, then another. Then an entire line of Marines stood, boots grinding softly into gravel, each raising their hand in slow unison. The captain was the last. He looked at her for a long moment, saw the sweat on her neck, the dust on her sleeves, the steadiness in her eyes, and something inside him surrendered. He unshouldered his rifle, let it hang loose by his side, and saluted with quiet respect. The crowd rose. Some clapped, some simply stood with hats in their hands, unsure whether to cheer or pray. Tessa stayed prone for one more breath, eyes still downrange, as if waiting for the echo to finish its long walk back. Then she lifted her head, set the safety, and pushed herself upright. Dust streaked her arms. Her braid clung to her collar. Her face was calm, neither victorious nor humble, just still. The colonel's voice carried softly. "Ma'am, on behalf of every marksman who's ever missed a shot, thank you." She shook her head. "Just physics, sir, you taught the rest." He smiled, faint and real. "Maybe, but you reminded us what it looks like when someone respects the work." The range officer called, almost whispering, "Cease fire." But everyone already knew. The range had gone still long before he said it. The applause came late, uneven, unsure. Not wild, but reverent, the sound of people trying to match the size of what they'd just seen. Tessa reached for a rag from her pocket, wiped the rifle clean with slow, tender motions. Her fingers lingered on the trigger guard, not nostalgic, just grateful. Then she laid the weapon on the bench, bolt open, chamber clear. When she turned to leave the line, the crowd parted without a word. The captain stepped forward first, extending his hand. She looked at it for a second before taking it. His voice came rough but honest. "You didn't just prove something today, you reminded us to listen." She smiled faintly. "The wind's always talking," she said. "We just forget how to hear it." He nodded, blinking against the glare. "Yes, ma'am." The colonel moved closer, eyes bright with the kind of pride that carries no ownership. "Gentlemen," he said to his Marines, "that's what right looks like." No one dared speak after that. The flags fluttered once, soft applause from the world itself. She walked back toward the vendor tent, boots whispering through dust. Mr. Dale stood there, cap twisted in his hands, eyes red around the edges. "You didn't tell anyone, did you?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, laughing under his breath. "Wouldn't have mattered if I had. Nobody'd have believed me." "Good," she said, smiling just enough to break the tension. "You sure you're coming to work Monday?" he asked, half teasing. She tilted her head toward the range, where Marines still crowded the targets, pointing at holes clustered tight in the steel. "I think the mounts on lane 4 need a little attention first." He laughed again, proud and tired. "You know," he said softly, "that was the best hardware demonstration I've ever seen." She smiled at that, small and human. Up in the bleachers, a teenage girl tugged at her father's sleeve. She works at the hardware store, right? Her father nodded, still staring at the line. Not anymore, kid, not after today. Tessa didn't hear them, or maybe she did and just kept walking. The light was changing now, less white, more copper. Long shadows reached across the ground, stretching toward the horizon. The smell of gun oil mixed with lemonade and dust. The laughter of the crowd began to return, softer, lighter, as if the range had exhaled with her. She passed the rope line and the Marines standing there stepped aside. Some saluted again, others simply nodded. Respect doesn't always know the right shape to take. The lieutenant colonel watched her go. For a man who gave orders for a living, silence was the only salute that felt right. By the time she reached her old pickup, the sky had turned amber. She climbed onto the tailgate, boots dangling above the dirt, elbows resting on her knees. The noise from the range drifted faintly, voices, laughter, someone retelling the story already. She didn't mind, let them tell it, it belonged to everyone now. She looked out across the flats where the wind carried small curls of dust, and the flag above the range stirred, proud and weary. It caught the last glint of sunlight and straightened, strong against the coming dusk. Tessa watched it for a long time. Then she looked down at her hands, rough, lined, scarred, and smiled to herself. No cameras caught that part. No one saw the way she exhaled through her nose, slow and content, as if 12 years of silence had finally found its ending note. She didn't need applause. She didn't need medals. What she had was enough. The echo of steel, the wind's quiet applause, the knowledge that she'd been true to her craft, to herself, to the discipline that had never left her hands. Somewhere behind her, a Marine shouted, "She hit all 101." The crowd answered with one last cheer, fading into laughter, disbelief, joy. But she was already looking toward the horizon, where the day was bleeding into gold. She rested her palms on her knees and whispered, almost too softly to hear, "It's never about showing them. It's about remembering who you are when you take the shot." The flag above her snapped once in the breeze, a single salute to a quiet kind of hero. And when the light thinned and the echoes faded into the open desert, only one truth lingered, simple, steady, undeniable. You don't need medals to carry mastery. Sometimes the quietest soldier still carries the sharpest aim. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. They don't need to. They've already earned the right to walk quietly among us, calm, steady, unseen. Until the day the world needs to remember what courage really looks like. Why do some victories feel quieter than defeat? The next morning the range was empty, just dust, brass, and the faint, metallic smell of what had been an unforgettable day. The steel plates downrange were pitted with clean holes, each one a small, perfect signature. Tessa stood alone at the edge of the line, her shadow long and thin in the new light. She'd driven out before sunrise, before anyone else could show up to dismantle the targets. The quiet suited her. It was how she liked things, without witnesses, without applause, just her and the wind. She crouched beside her rifle case, fingers brushing a patch of sand still blackened from the muzzle blast. She thought of the faces from yesterday, the boy with the flag, the colonel's salute, the captain's awkward, humbled handshake. All those eyes so wide, so full of realization. And she thought of the one person who wasn't there to see it. The young soldier from years ago, the accident, the guilt that had stayed longer than anyone else. "Wind doesn't lie," she whispered into the empty air, repeating the line she'd once told him. "We just stopped listening." She'd come back here to listen again. The breeze picked up, fluttering the corner of an old scorecard pinned to the bench. It trembled like a heartbeat before tearing loose and drifting toward her feet. She picked it up. The handwriting was hers, faded pencil, half smudged. It was from a class she'd taught over a decade ago. "Far flag first. Wind is an old language. Listen before you speak." She folded it neatly, slipped it into her jacket pocket, and closed the case. The sound of gravel broke the silence. "You beat sunrise again," a voice said. She turned. The lieutenant colonel stood by a rusted Humvee, coffee in one hand, his cap in the other. The lines under his eyes looked deeper today, but softer too. "Old habits," she said. He nodded toward the targets. "The news trucks were here at 5, thought you'd be too. I don't do interviews." I told them that. A smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Appreciate it." He walked closer, slow, respectful, the way one might approach a gravesite. "You know, I saw a lot of men shoot yesterday, but I only saw one listen." She looked at the horizon, listening all that was left. He nodded, quiet for a long moment. "I heard about the accident, years back." Her jaw flexed, but she didn't look at him. "That's old. Doesn't mean it's over." "I know," she bent, brushing dust from the rifle case, "but yesterday helped." The colonel took a sip of coffee, eyes tracing the range. "You gave my men something they didn't know they were missing, respect. Not for rank, for discipline." She said nothing. After a long pause, he handed her a folded envelope. "From the commandant's office. No media, no headlines, just this." She took it, hesitant. Inside, a single page, honorary citation, exceptional marksmanship, and instructional merit. At the bottom, handwritten, "To Ms. Tessa Rowan, you reminded us that precision without humility is hollow." Her eyes lingered on that line for a while. "That's too kind," she said finally. "It's not enough," he replied, "but it's something." She folded the paper back into the envelope and slipped it into her case without ceremony. "I'll frame it behind the counter, next to the drill bits." He chuckled softly. "You're serious." "I always am." They stood there for a while, not speaking. The wind picked up, sweeping sand across the range, whispering through the spent casings like chimes. Finally, the colonel said, "We're holding a training symposium next month. Wind reading, environmental adjustments. I'd like you to speak." She shook her head. "I'm done teaching." "You said that before," he reminded her. She smiled faintly. "This time I mean it." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'll keep the chair open anyway." "Do that," she said softly. He turned to leave, boots crunching in rhythm. Halfway to the truck, he stopped. "You know," he said without looking back, "there's a difference between walking away and walking home." She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. When the Humvee rumbled away, the quiet returned, the kind that isn't lonely, just full. She sat on the bench, closed her eyes, and listened. The flags whispered softly. The steel plates clanked gently in the morning breeze. It almost sounded like applause again. By mid-morning, the base had come alive with rumor. The story spread like wind through a canyon, shifting, reshaping. Some said she hit 80 in a row, others said 200, but everyone agreed on one thing: she hadn't missed. A reporter's blog posted a photo of her walking away from the range, dust swirling around her boots, the rifle case in hand. The caption read, "She walked off before the cheering started." Within hours, that photo circled every feed. Veterans shared it. Shooters analyzed it. Civilians argued about it. But no one could agree who she really was: a soldier, a legend, a myth. Tessa didn't read any of it. She was back behind the counter of her small hardware store, sleeves rolled up, grease under her nails. The radio played quietly from the back, local news fading in and out between static. And in other headlines, the unidentified woman who stunned Marines during yesterday's precision shoot remained silent, declining all requests for interview. She turned the dial until the voice disappeared under music. The door chime rang. A teenage girl stepped inside, hat tucked under one arm, notebook in the other. Her face was half curiosity, half awe. "Excuse me," she said, voice small. "Are you the one from the range?" Tessa smiled but didn't confirm. "Depends who's asking." I just wanted to say, the girl fumbled for words. That was the coolest thing I've ever seen. Was it? The girl nodded eagerly. You made it look like you were part of it, not fighting it, just listening. Tessa paused. That's a good word, she said softly. Listening. Can you teach me? The girl blurted. Not shooting, just how to stay that calm. Tessa leaned on the counter, studying her. Takes time. I've got time. Something warm flickered behind Tessa's eyes. For the first time in years, the idea of teaching didn't feel heavy. All right, she said. Come by Saturday morning, we'll start with wind. The girl grinned so wide it hurt to watch. Really? Really, but you bring patience. That's the part you can't buy here. The girl nodded hard, almost saluting before running out the door. Tessa watched her go, then turned back to the counter. Her reflection in the glass case looked different now, lighter, maybe even younger. Outside, the wind pushed through the open doorway, curling around her like an old friend. She closed her eyes and smiled. I hear you, she whispered. By sunset, the range had been cleared. The steel plates were stored, the flags rolled, the benches empty. But one small mark remained, etched into the dirt where she'd lain prone, the outline of her elbows, faint but visible. A new recruit, sweeping the line that evening, paused over it. He didn't know who had left it, only that something about the shape felt sacred. He brushed it lightly with his hand, then stood at attention for a moment before moving on. The wind erased the mark by morning. But stories, unlike footprints, don't vanish that easily. Why do the quietest moments leave the loudest echoes? Days passed. The range returned to its drills, the laughter of new recruits, the usual noise of duty and dust. But something had shifted, subtle, invisible, like the way wind changes just before rain. The Marines who'd been there that day carried it with them. The captain, once too proud to listen, found himself pausing before he spoke, listening for the air, not just the noise. During training, he caught a recruit overcorrecting his aim and said softly, "Don't chase the wind. Let it show you what it wants." The recruit blinked, "Sir." The captain smiled faintly, "Trust me, you'll hit truer that way." He didn't credit the phrase, didn't mention the woman who taught him its meaning by existing, but every time he repeated it, something steadied inside him. At night, he replayed her last shot, the stillness, the grace, the sound, not for performance, for peace. The spotter went back to his notebook, pages filled now with her principles written in tight, deliberate print. Wind before math, feel before measure. He started every training session with that line. Some thought it poetic, others confusing. But those who stayed long enough to understand it found their shots cleaner, their breathing calmer. And across the base, that single afternoon became more than an event. It became a story, one told in whispers and shared over coffee cups and barrack bunks. They said it like a parable. She never missed. She never bragged. She just listened. No one needed to embellish it. The truth was enough. In town, the hardware store began seeing new faces. Veterans, young recruits, even the occasional local who'd never held a rifle but wanted to shake her hand. Tessa handled it the way she handled everything, calmly, politely, never leaning into the spotlight. One old Marine came in holding a photograph of the range. His eyes were watery, hands trembling. "My son was there," he said. "He said it felt like church." She smiled gently. "Then I suppose the sermon worked." He laughed once, nodded, and left the photo on the counter before walking out. She didn't frame it, just tucked it beneath the register, private, unseen. Saturday came. The girl returned, same hat, same notebook, nervous energy buzzing in her step. Tessa was already out back behind the shop, a small stretch of dry field where the wind could play teacher. "Stand here," Tessa said, pointing to a line of dirt. "Now close your eyes." The girl frowned but obeyed. "What do you feel?" The wind." Tessa smiled faintly. Good, what's it saying? It's cold. Cold isn't a direction. The girl giggled, then left. Tessa nodded. Better, now open your eyes. What's the grass doing? It's bending. Which means? The girl thought for a moment. Wind stronger at the ground than up high. Tessa's brow lifted slightly. You're paying attention. That's the first rule. What's the second? Don't assume you already know the third. The girl laughed, the sound bright and warm against the lazy hum of the afternoon. They stood there a while, watching dust whirl in slow, thoughtful spirals. Were you scared? The girl asked suddenly. That day on the range. Tessa hesitated. The question came out of nowhere, but it deserved honesty. Yes, she said finally, but not of missing, of remembering. Remembering what? That I'd once forgotten how to listen. The girl didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway, the way young hearts do when they sense something important but can't yet name it. The weeks that followed came gentle. Every evening after closing, Tessa would clean the counters, lock the door, then step out back just to stand still and feel the air. Sometimes she brought the girl, sometimes she didn't. Either way, the ritual never changed. A breath, a moment, a quiet conversation with the wind. Rumors about her still moved through the world like driftwood, half true, half guessed. A shooting magazine ran an article titled "The Woman Who Humbled the Corps." Another called her the Wind Whisperer. She ignored them all. The only letters she read were from recruits, scribbled notes sent through the colonel's office, thanking her for reminding them that patience was part of courage. One note said simply, "Your silence spoke louder than any order I've ever been given." That one she kept, folded, worn in her wallet. One evening the captain drove into town. He didn't wear his uniform, just jeans, a plain shirt, and a look of quiet respect. He found her closing the shop. "Ma'am," he said softly, tipping his head. She smiled. "Captain, thought you'd forgotten how to find this place." "Never," he hesitated, then said. "The men still talk about you. I wanted you to know that." "I'm sure they've got better things to do." He shook his head. "Not better, just louder." She studied him a moment. "You shoot different now." He nodded. "You notice everything, don't you?" "It's a habit." He laughed softly. "We've been running a new drill, Rowan wind calls, they call them. Reading the far flag first, then trusting your breath. We even made it standard practice." Her brow lifted slightly. "You did?" "Yeah, it works, cuts misses in half." Tessa said nothing, just a slow, almost reluctant smile. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small brass token. "We had these made for the unit. One for you, too." She turned it over. It wasn't fancy, just a marksmanship emblem engraved with 5 words. "Listen, adjust, breathe, believe, fire." She traced the edge of it with her thumb. "Who came up with that?" He smiled. "You did." She didn't remember saying it, but maybe she had, somewhere between the shots and the silence. He looked around the little shop, the rows of nails, ropes, paint cans, the smell of oil and sawdust. "You ever miss it?" he asked quietly. She looked up from the token. "Every day." He nodded, understanding. "We miss you too." For a long moment they stood there. No rank, no titles, just two people who'd seen how fragile perfection can be. Then she slipped the token into her pocket and said, "Thank you, Captain." He hesitated at the door, then added, "Ma'am, that last shot, I think it saved more than a few of us. You made us remember what it means to care again." She looked at him, voice soft. "Then it was worth every breath." He nodded and left, the bell above the door chiming once before the wind swallowed the sound. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, the air cool and restless. The brass token gleamed faintly in her hand. She thought about all the noise in the world, the shouting, the pride, the endless race to be seen. and how strange it felt that the truest moments always came without audience, without spotlight. The girl's laughter, the captain's humility, the quiet between shots. All of it whispered the same truth. You don't have to shout to make history. Sometimes, all it takes is stillness, so complete it teaches others to breathe again. She set the token on the railing and leaned back, eyes tracing the constellations that hung over the desert. Stars, so many of them, each one burning alone, yet together forming something larger, something that guided people home. She smiled to herself. Maybe that was what legacy really was. Not fame, not record boards, just light that keeps traveling long after you've gone quiet. The wind brushed across her face, soft as breath. "Good night," she whispered. It was early spring when the girl, no longer so young, stepped onto that same firing line. The air had the same taste it did years ago, that dry electric stillness that always came before a shot. She set down her pack, unrolled her mat, and laid out her rifle, older than she was, its stock polished smooth from patient hands. Beside her, the wind twisted softly through the flags. A man in fatigues walked up, clipboard in hand. "You knew." She smiled, sort of. He nodded toward the rifle. "That's an antique. You sure you want to use that?" "It's the one that listens," she said quietly. He frowned but said nothing. When she went prone, her movements were unhurried, purposeful. She checked the far flag first, just as Tessa had taught her. The others fluttered wrong, noisy with lies. She waited until they settled, then breathed out once. Her first shot rang clean, bright against the steel. The man's head jerked up. "Dead center, how'd you?" She smiled faintly, not looking up. "Wind told me." The second shot came faster, confident. Another hit, then another. "Who trained you?" he asked, disbelief shading his tone. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she said simply, "A woman who taught me that calm isn't weakness, it's focus." He nodded, watching the line of impacts form a perfect chain across the target. By the time she reached 20, the same hush that once fell for Tessa now blanketed the range again. The flags stirred, the rifles paused, even the chatter from the tents dimmed. History was repeating, not as echo but as continuation. That evening the girl drove to the edge of town, the sun sinking low over the fields. The hardware store still stood there, paint faded, windows dusty. The sign read Rowan's Tools and Supply, the same it always had. She parked, climbed the porch steps, and knocked gently on the door. It opened before her, knuckles fell a second time. Tessa stood there, silver now threading through her hair, the same steady calm in her eyes. She wore an old denim shirt, sleeves rolled, hands stained with oil. "Told you I'd be here," Tessa said. The girl smiled. "You always are." They sat outside on the porch, the light turning gold, the smell of pine and sawdust thick in the air. "You still training?" Tessa asked. The girl nodded, "Teaching more than training now." Tessa raised an eyebrow. "You're too young to be the teacher." "That's what they said about you." Tessa chuckled softly, "Touché." They sat quietly for a while. The girl traced the edge of a small brass token in her pocket, the same design, the same 5 words. "Listen, adjust, breathe, believe, fire." "I gave one of these to a recruit today," the girl said. "Told him what you told me, that it's not about the target, it's about who you are when you aim." Tessa looked out over the horizon. "And what did he say?" "He said he wants to hit the impossible." Tessa smiled. "Then I hope he learns that the impossible's just what happens when patience finally meets purpose." The girl laughed. "You always have a line for everything." "Not everything," Tessa said quietly, "just the things worth remembering." The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange into the dust. Later, when the girl left, Tessa stood in the doorway, watching her drive off until the taillights disappeared into the desert. The night air cooled. Crickets started their slow, rhythmic song. Inside, the shop was dim. Tools hung like old soldiers at rest, each with its own story. She moved behind the counter, wiping it down with a cloth, the same motion she'd done 1,000 times. In the corner hung a faded photograph, the one the Marine's father had left years ago. She'd finally framed it, though not for herself, for anyone who came in looking for what courage looked like without noise. Beneath it on the counter lay her rifle, clean, silent, waiting. She ran her hand along the barrel, the metal cool against her skin. The same rifle that had once bridged the gap between her guilt and her grace. There were new scratches now, each one a memory. She whispered to it, barely audible, "We did all right, didn't we?" The wind outside the door answered softly through the screen. Sometimes at dusk, the locals swore they saw her out past the edge of town, sitting on the tailgate of that same old pickup, looking toward the hills. Not shooting, not teaching, just listening. They said you could tell it was her by the stillness. The kind of stillness that wasn't empty but full, like a song too sacred for sound. And every so often, when the air was just right, someone at the range miles away could swear they heard it too. The faint, impossible ring of steel echoing from nowhere. Clank. One perfect note, rolling across time. The girl, now a woman, eventually took over the shop, painted the sign, fixed the roof, but kept the name, Rowan's Tools and Supply. She taught kids from town, recruits from the base, even a few old veterans who just wanted to remember how to breathe between storms. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she'd open the back door and let the desert wind sweep through the aisles, carrying sawdust and memory. Because she knew, somewhere in that whisper, Tessa was still there. Years later, a visitor came by, a young reporter, camera in hand, looking for the woman behind the legend. "Is Ms. Rowan still alive?" he asked. The girl, now the keeper of the name, smiled. "She's out there." "Where?" The girl gestured toward the horizon, "Anywhere the wind's honest." The reporter looked confused. So she was real. "Real enough to be missed," she said, "and quiet enough to be remembered." The reporter didn't quite understand, but he wrote the story anyway. It ran under the headline, "The Woman Who Listened to the Wind." He got most of the details wrong, but the feeling, he got that part right. As for Tessa, no one ever saw her leave, but somehow everyone knew when she was gone. The store stayed open. The rifle stayed on the wall. The lesson stayed alive. And the wind. The wind never stopped talking. If you stood on that range today, with the flags bending low and the heat shimmering over the sand, you could still feel it. That invisible calm between gusts, that pause where the world holds its breath. It feels like her. Not the hero version the headlines tried to paint. Not the myth. Just the woman who once asked for a borrowed rifle and gave the world a lesson instead of a spectacle. Because legacy isn't measured in noise. It's measured in steadiness, in patience, in the echoes of those who keep aiming true long after you've gone quiet. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear it too. The faint hum of wind over distance. The soft heartbeat between trigger and steel. The quiet proof that dignity doesn't need to shout. It just breathes, waits, acts. And when the moment comes, it strikes true, then fades, leaving only stillness in its place. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.